If you can hear me, I'm sorry. I'm working on it.
Can hear you. For today, so I am not going to delay anymore, and we will get started with our budget, calling our budget committee, St. Paul City Council Budget Committee to order. So good morning. We have, for folks tuning into our budget process today for the first time, we were presented a budget by the mayor's office with a proposed levy increase in the general fund of 6.9%. That doesn't mean raising our taxes 6.9%, but rather just increasing our tax capacity and our base. We are responsible for setting a levy limit in mid-September. That we will work in those parameters and then set a final budget in December. And that is the council's job to comb through the details of the budget. And we always set the levy limit about 4 weeks after we get a budget presentation, which is fast and furious. And so we're on a mission to get through as much top line information as we can from our departments, recognizing that we may, after we set a levy limit, come back and ask more questions. And so we are trying to get through our large general fund departments in advance of that. Last week we heard from parks. This week we are hearing from police. And again, setting our levy limit, I believe, on the 15th. I'm looking at you, Holly, the 15th of September. So we've got our work cut out for us. As I mentioned, we are hearing from the police department. We're joined by Chief Todd Axtell. I understand the format of our presentation. We'll start out with a presentation from the chief, about 15 minutes, and then we'll move to Q&A. We have 2 hours set aside, so we have plenty of time to ask questions. If something comes up during the initial 15 minutes, just jot it down and we'll get to it during the Q&A portion. I would also just like to start out by saying to you, Chief, how much I appreciate you and your force and the work that you have done in the most unusual of years that we've had, and just the amount of times, the amount of that you and your department have shown up in community, whether it's to let folks freely protest, sometimes against you, sometimes for just for really in this tumultuous time that you have been there. You have been there through an increase in gun shots and gun violence, and we appreciate that work. None of us knows the trauma that must face officers that are first on scene in some of the tragedies this last weekend. It was particularly horrific, and we just appreciate and respect the work that you're doing there. So thank you, and thank you to your team in advance of this presentation. It's just been quite a year, and we do this in partnership with you. So thank you very much. I'll turn things over to you to kick off. And again, we'll save our Q&A until you're done with your initial remarks, and then it sounds like we've got plenty of time to dig in. So thank you very much for being here today, and thanks to your entire department for your tireless work.
Council President, council members, thank you so much. Council President Brenman, thank you for the kind words. I know many of our officers will be watching today, and the heartfelt words that you just provided means a lot. So we appreciate that. And what my plan is today is to really go through about 15 to 20 minutes of just kind of the state of the department, some of the challenges that we're facing, and then certainly have a lot of time for question and answer. And I'll do the best I can answering any questions that you may have. So I'll just kick it off and And again, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the St. Paul Police Department, our mission, its current condition, and the city's budget safety related to safety, the needs in our city. And over 5 years ago, I can't believe it's been that long, but I took an oath to work in partnership with our entire city to adhere to the ethical values of professionalism, integrity, responsiveness, sensitivity, respect, and openness. Since then, we've worked hard to take an already outstanding police department and make it even better. One that connects with this community at historic levels and protects the peace and maintains public safety through trusted service with respect. And when I say we've worked hard, I mean all of us, community members, all of you, the entire city council, Mayor Carter, and most notably certainly are the women and men of the St. Paul Police Department. And we've made incredible progress in partnership with all of you in our community. We established a community engagement division, which entirely is dedicated to building and galvanizing connections with our entire community. We've recruited, trained, and embraced a new generation of diverse guardians, and there are people from all walks of life in all neighborhoods who answer the call to serve something greater than themselves. We've built one of the premier crime labs in the country, established a co-responder team of mental health crisis workers and our police officers. This team is known as the Community Outreach and Stabilization Unit. We launched a world-class body-worn camera program and enhanced our training program to far exceed the state post standards and their requirements. Training that is focused as much on skills, as much on ethical policing, moral courage, and professionalism. Out of necessity, we've developed a unit to facilitate peaceful protests while protecting people, property, and free speech. And in fact, already this year, our Special Operations Unit and our officers have staffed 260 demonstrations, protests, and marches, which is more than we had during all of last year in 2020. This unit has been created by the reallocation of resources within our department, resources that traditionally responded primarily to 911 calls and calls from our community. We've seen our officers accept innovations and evolutions, use field trauma care techniques and Narcan to save more lives than we have ever before, achieve homicide clearance rates that are the envy of cities across our country, and we use force only when it's reasonable, necessary, and done with respect. In fact, for the past 2 years, your police department has achieved a record low for police misconduct civil payouts, $24,000 in 2019 and $5,000 in 2020. And your officers did all of this while absorbing a lot more work during historic levels of crime, civil unrest, even riots, unprecedented levels of vitriol, and a pandemic. They showed up day and night, took on overtime, and simply didn't have the choice to work from home. Over the past 5 years, we put together an organization that is distinctly St. Paul's. We began to reimagine what policing could be. We began by reimagining what policing could be. We embraced the 21st century policing model, which was put together by President Obama at the time. This gives our officers the tools and the support they need to grow as guardians and recruited people who reflect our community and, really more importantly, share our community values. We built a department held together by an unwavering commitment to trust, service, and respect, the core values of our department. Our community members have high expectations of their officers, as they should. They want more than just officers who show up, take reports, and move on to the next call. Simply just the facts, ma'am, doesn't work anymore. The people we serve have authenticity, care, warmth, and follow through. This is what our public servants expect and receive day in and day out from our police officers. And I'm profoundly proud of the women and men of the St. Paul Police Department who strap on their bullet-resistant vests, pin their badges, and step up for people in need. And I know you are too, because without your support, none of the many accomplishments that I just listed would have been possible. The St. Paul Police Department is a world-class police agency. But, there are things that keep me up at night. I'm incredibly concerned about our ability to maintain the momentum without adequate funding. Right now, the women and men who hold this department together are being pushed to the brink. And to put it bluntly, right now, we're getting by on our officers' sheer resolve, their relentlessness to commitment to victims, and unfortunately, a bit of luck. And I worry that our good fortune will eventually run out. Over the last 3 years, we've seen many of the things we've built, things that we've taken pride in, and they're beginning to shrink. Our community engagement division has gotten smaller. It's important to note that this division is not just engaging the community. It also includes traffic and pedestrian safety, special operations, community partnerships, youth outreach and programming, and subunits such as parking enforcement and law enforcement career path academy. We've gone from 102 people in this division to 86. We've had to suspend our police civilian academy, the Explorer program, and some engagement opportunities. And we're at a risk of losing significantly more of the division if we continue to reassign our resources to handle emergencies. And as I've said in the past, police agencies that simply show up to take emergency calls without developing trust and relationships really risk being perceived by our communities as an occupying force. Our training program is also suffering. Just over a year ago, we far exceeded post requirements with programs like ethical policing is courageous, moral courage, and scenario-based training environments. We no longer have the capacity to take officers off the streets as frequently as we have done in the past for these trainings. Today, we're doing the minimum to maintain the licensure of our police officers. And there's an old saying, we don't rise to the level of our expectations, we fall to the level of our training. It's important to note that we're losing officers at an alarming rate. Some were members of our Law Enforcement Career Path Academy, which means the progress we've made towards diversifying our department is at risk. As you know, the Law Enforcement Career Path Academy is a 3-year journey, a lot of investment, a lot of time to get to where they can become a police officer. We've lost these graduates to Maplewood, Minneapolis, Ramsey County, Lakeville, just to name a few. And all the people were from St. Paul. They were diverse, they faced barriers, and they wanted to serve something bigger than themselves, our city. But we weren't able to keep them because we did not have an academy in 2020. Others are new recruits, young people who came to the St. Paul Police Department really because, in their words, the St. Paul Police Department values community policing. And now some have left for other agencies where they don't have to run call to call and they can spend more time getting to know the people they serve. A few weeks ago, we had 2 young officers turn in their badges and join other agencies. They wanted to spend more time on community policing, which is a luxury that St. Paul police officers have less time to do today than they ever have. We're also losing officers at an alarming rate to the medical leaves. Already this year, we've had 26 officers leave the profession due to medical conditions, and historically that number has been 1 or 2. Any organization would be concerned about the level of loss. If not for the talent, experience, and the skill walking out the door, then at least we have to look at the cost associated with recruiting, training, and onboarding these employees. And I talked a little bit about that earlier. It's important to know that it costs $137,000 and takes 9 months, 5 months of an academy for the next academy, and 4 months of field training to onboard a new officer, making sure they're ready to serve as St. Paul Guardians. And the dedication of officers who remain are overworked. They're being forced to work overtime to meet the public safety needs at our ballparks, stadiums, entertainment venues, and shortages on the street. They're foregoing time off with their families and sacrificing a healthy work-life balance to serve our city, and I'm really proud of them for that. But it does come at a cost. And the effects are being felt throughout the city. We're hearing concerns from people because our coast unit, our mental health unit, in other words, is down to just 2 mental health resource team officers from 5 not that long ago. We've had to reassign our homeless outreach person, and today we're more of a follow-up role in this than a co-responder role as we've been in the past. Our officers no longer have the ability to be proactive as we have in the past relating to this intervention effort. We're hearing from people who live in St. Paul, own businesses here, and work in the city that they're not getting as much time with their officers as they would like and they would expect. We're hearing from people in neighborhoods who are seeing and enduring drivers racing through our neighborhoods at 50, 60, and yes, even sometimes 100 miles per hour. And we can't devote full-time officers to the problem because we've made the tough decision to discontinue our traffic enforcement unit, so we have enough people to respond to 911 calls. Tragically, this year, we've had 13 people lose their lives in crashes compared to 9 people the same time last year. Our officers are still making it to the 911 calls, but if you ever listen to a scanner, and I really encourage all of you to do so when you can, you're likely to hear dispatch say the words that you never want to hear, and that is, "I need a squad to break." This means an officer must leave a call, sometimes leaving a community member in need, to rush to a more pressing call. "I need a squad to break" are words that suck the air from our collective souls. It means the officers have to run from one victim to the next. It means that our officers don't have the time to deliver the level of service people want and need, and the level of service, quite frankly, that I demand. Some will look at the queue times and say that we're doing better because they're relatively low. Now, the queue time is the time where the call comes into the comm center to the time it gets dispatched. But in fact, our queue times are more than 1.5 minutes longer for our most serious crimes than they were when I became chief just 5 years ago. More calls, fewer officers, longer waits, more calls timing out. These are the realities in our city today. And the challenges aren't only on patrol. Our investigators are feeling the pain as well. Already this year, our forensic services unit has been called out to process crime scenes 225 times, which is 58% more than they were just 2 years ago in 2019. And they're struggling to keep up with the high demand. We're getting more reports of shots fired than ever before. More than 150 people have been injured or killed by gunfire so far this year. And even more disturbing to me is the fact that 75% of these victims are Black. And this is in a city that represents 16.9% of our community is African American Black. If we could staff an adequate investigative capacity, we would have the ability to fully staff our gang and gun unit. We would be able to prevent future shootings because it's not rocket science to understand very few people do most of the shooting. But we had to take 6 officers from our gang and gun unit and put them back on the streets to cover 911 calls. Now, I'm incredibly proud of Mayor Carter's Community First public safety approach and the work of the commission. Investing in approaches for alternatives to police response and preventing crime before it happens is prudent and an approach that I wholeheartedly support. I'd also like to highlight the work of our community partners, including our ambassadors, Healing Streets, Project Safe Neighborhoods, 21 Days of Peace, and there are many more, too many to mention. And the incredible work led by Deputy Mayor Jamie Tincher, which is having a significant impact on our unsheltered population, in addition to her work with the area action plans in cooperation with our department and other departments. This work is having a positive impact on the quality of life issues downtown. And as our city continues to invest in effective alternatives, my recommendation is that we ensure that all of our capacity in the St. Paul Police Department is maintained. You don't have to look very far or very hard to find cities across the country experiencing skyrocketing crime when these approaches are funded at the expense of police investments. And of course, we would all like to live in a world where there's less need for the police, but until the data shows it's prudent to do so, it would be irresponsible to not invest in both approaches. We're struggling to follow up on our NIBIN leads because of reduced staffing, which allows investigators and follows the shooters and hold shooters accountable for their crimes. Everyone is proud of the exceptional work being done by our homicide and robbery unit, and we should be. They're the best in the country, hands down. Their work makes headlines on a regular basis, but let me just take a minute to tell you what the news stories don't. They're incredibly overworked, as are all of our units. This year, each investigator in our homicide robbery unit is on pace to work 168 cases. In fact, it's common for them to work cases for literally days at a time and around the clock. This past weekend is a tragic reminder, an example of that work. 4 homicides in 36 hours. And for a unit that size, it's unheard of and it's heartbreaking. Then there are all the other units that have to support the investigations for homicides, such as forensic services. The homicide unit is one which we've heavily invested in. Some would say they're fully staffed, but I think that that's even a specious claim. Here are the caseloads in other units, which aren't as well staffed. Family violence, average of 315 cases per investigator a year. Auto theft, 1,300 cases per year. Sex crimes, 160 cases a year. Arson, 406 cases a year. Investigators who are left in our gang and gun unit are working 322 cases a year. Each of the 2 investigators in our district offices work about 750 cases per year. Now, if you can imagine having your car stolen and being told that your case is one of more than 1,300 being worked by an investigator, you can just imagine the frustration that you'd feel at that time. And I talk about equity and crime victimization really do go hand in hand. And I've told the story before about the fact that if I get my car stolen in front of my house, it's terrible, it's an inconvenience, but I call my insurance company and I get a new car, right? A young mother who lives in Frogtown or Dayton's Bluff gets her car stolen in front of her car. It may be $1,000 car. She's working 2 jobs to support 4 kids. She can't afford insurance. The car is stolen. And now she can't get to work. She can't get her kids around. And it's a traumatic event in the life of people who are living below the poverty line. So we have to think about victims of crime as we talk about budgets for the police department. And another thing that really keeps me up at night is the fact that our public safety needs are only going to continue to grow as they have been. We've got the Highland development, the bridge development, and the Hillcrest golf course development on the horizon. This is in addition to many more housing projects. These opportunities will add thousands of new households, bring thousands of new residents, and 1,500 employees just at the Highland Bridge site. So what are we doing about the challenges? Well, we're innovating, we're reshuffling our deck and adjusting deployment. We're looking for efficiencies and we're soliciting support from all of our partners. Over the past several years, our department's worked hard to develop programs to make positive differences in the community with minimal investments from the city. The Coast Unit is almost entirely funded through grants and partnerships. The same is true with the Career Path Academy. Thankfully, the Career Path Academy will be funded by our city in 2022 and beyond due to the proven success of the program. And our St. Paul Police Foundation and local businesses paid for pepper ball, rifle plates, and other tools that keep our community and our officers more safe. The body-worn camera program, which continues to grow, isn't yet fully funded by the city. We have an in-car camera system that I have been asking for many years to replace. It regularly fails. We're unfortunately losing evidence, but more importantly, we're operating without the civil protection of adequate cameras watching over people and our officers we place in the back of our squads. We launched an online reporting system to celebrate it as a success, but it's important to understand that it really does come at a cost. We've received more than 10,000 online reports in the last 2 years. Really, many of the reforms other departments enacted over the last 15 months were in place long ago in our department. And I'm not a believer of waiting for tragedies to happen before we make meaningful changes. And I owe it to the people we serve to be progressive, innovative, and willing to change not only when necessary, but before it's necessary. And our officers have not only embraced the change, they've championed it. But we're really losing our ability to fund our forward-thinking opportunities. We're struggling to maintain the excellence that we've worked so hard to achieve, and I'm deeply concerned of losing the momentum that we have poured our lives into. But I'm also an optimist. Properly resourced, we can do better to prepare our guardians for the infrequently but highly complicated and consequential calls where lives do and can hang in the balance. We can once again take advantage of the training opportunities we're currently missing. We can use the available, affordable technology we're not currently using, and we can get back to preparing our guardians to do the very difficult, very serious work of keeping our city safe, reassuring the people who live, work, and visit the city, and continue to make St. Paul a place where people want to live, work, and play, and where people want to spend their free time. And all of the great things we've built over the last 5 years remain in place for the moment. But I'm concerned that at some point, something will give. And if we want the best, most diverse officers, we have to invest in recruiting, training, retraining, and retaining them. If we want a world-class police department, we should invest in a world-class equipment. If we want the best trained officers, we need to train that surpasses the post requirements. And at some point, we have to ask ourselves, really, what do we want our police department to look like? What do we want it to do? And our people need to understand, our community needs to understand that we will always be here to answer your 911 calls. We promise that. But I know both as a resident and your police chief, what truly I think our city wants and they expect and they deserve more than they're getting now. A few years ago, I stood on the city council chambers in front of most of you, and I said that I needed 50 new officers to keep up with the projected growth and demands and to continue the progressive work of our police department. Obviously, that didn't happen. In fact, we have less officers today than we did when I made that request. Today, I'm here asking for a modest increase in our budget, $3.1 million. Just enough to ensure that we can maintain all we've built. This would allow us to maintain our authorized sworn strength of 620 throughout the entire year. This would also be contingent upon a $1.25 million federal COPS office grant available to our city, and history has shown that we've always fared well with these grants. And please know that I do understand the financial dynamics and challenges our city is facing. I was optimistic while working on this budget with the mayor's office. At their request, I presented a hiring model which allows the department to recover from our current staffing deficit and maintain our authorized strength. My modest request of $3.1 million represents less than 2% of the $166 million in ARP funds the city has and will receive. But its impact on the future of public safety will be immense. And our city grapples with how to appropriately fund the police department. In our duty to protect the peace and maintain public safety, I respectfully request that you consider all that we have accomplished together and move carefully to consider my heartfelt and experience-based proposal. Thank you for your service and your time, and please know that the women and men of the St. Paul Police Department are here and committed to devoting every ounce of energy toward providing the best police service possible to all of you and our entire community. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Before we go to questions, I guess I appreciate getting state of the police department and an overview. I've heard some details, or not some details, some also overview of your budget proposal. And I'm wondering, is part of your presentation here today to go over what is the police budget and changes that are therein, or is your preference that that's just open-ended questions from the council?
Thank you, Council President. It's whatever you prefer. We have a slide deck that we wanted to update today through the end of August, so you have the most current crime trends and patterns and statistics. You all were sent that a little while ago. So all of the information we have gathered with the budget information, the challenges that we're having, the statistics, the staffing model that we have presented is all in that slide deck. And whether it's today or anytime, as you all know, I'm available 24/7 on my phone. I'm willing to take any questions or meet personally with specific questions as well. So I was hoping that today would just be maybe asking questions from you, concerns that you may have, and things that I can help shine a light on for you.
Well, it would be helpful for me, and I'm looking at my colleagues on the screen to, I mean, this is a part of our budget process, and we are looking at the budget. So if part of your deck is specifically pointing to, you've mentioned the attrition, the staffing model changes that you're proposing, and I know that's something that I've been interested in learning more about. But if you could go to some of your budget details, I think that would help us frame this conversation around the budget, which is really what's in front of us today, and recognizing also that we have, you know, more perspective and context now as we head into that conversation. But if you have a slide deck that specifically points to the 2022 budget, I think it would be helpful for the council to see that presentation to frame the questions that we may have for you today.
Okay, I have Assistant Chief Thomaser right now looking through the slide deck to see if there's anything that is an overview, but I can simply summarize that there's been hardly any changes. There's been some additions that I can explain in detail. There's a few that I'd like to articulate for you.
Okay, and I see Ms. Jalali has a hand up. So while Mr. Thomaser, or Chief Thomaser, is grabbing that slide, we'll go to Ms. Jalali for a moment. Ms. Jalali.
Thanks. Hope everyone can hear me all right. I appreciate the chance to be in this conversation. I think that before we talk about specifics and get into the deck, that there are just some really important glaring omissions that need to be said. It's not just for the sake of all of us in this conversation, it's for the sake of the public who is a part of this process, and it's for the sake of the greater community. It feels like your narrative of what has happened in the last year and a half very lightly acknowledges what are actually the most heavily driving conditions of both the conditions officers are facing and the conditions our community members are even more disproportionately impacted by. We are in a global pandemic with historic job loss. Eviction moratoria are expiring now. We only got significant federal aid over a year into this entire battle, which is still going. We experienced internationally historic civil unrest and uprisings against both police brutality and then the conditions systemically that people are crushed by that are part of the same outgrowth of white supremacy, structural racism, and there's just more community instability than ever. That civil unrest is because an officer put his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and snuffed the life out of him on live video and sparked an international reckoning with a familiar cause that, yes, do most of our police officers do that, or have they ever? No. Does that mean that any one of them could if left unattended? Yes, we are one tinder spark away from another uprising. We spent millions and millions of dollars on police funding for coordinated efforts. Our city was occupied by an occupied force, not just by the National Guard, but by the Hamlin Station and the Western Precinct, which was barricaded long before and long after the Chauvin trials. And we spent thousands and thousands of dollars of city money on that and other sites across the city without actually any oversight of that. And we as an office tried to get just basic answers about that, and were blown off or given very, very spare answers. And in addition to all this, there are more people at home than ever with, frankly, nowhere else to call because we're still building it out. But all they do is call 911 for the vast majority of calls placed to 911 that are non-life-threatening situations that don't require a police officer. And so in addition to a documented nationwide increase in incidents because of these social and economic conditions that are extraordinary, There's also a bloating of the volume of self-reported non-incidents of what normally happens anyway, regardless of conditions, because of the combination of population growth, people just keep reproducing, sort of the nature of people, and also the unaddressed underlying conditions that are often driving people to crime or instability, and also the fact that most places around the country haven't even done what we've started to do as the city of St. Paul in building out our community first public safety system. And we are, 3 years now barely into that. I won't even say 3, because in my first budget cycle, I was standing here trying to understand how we're adding or proposing to add 9 officers, and we had no vision for an alternative system or a parallel system that was helping. Thank you for your support of the commission. We now finally have the seeds of that effort in a way that we can advance in this budget cycle. That is really important. It is also routinely held by this council and by other people to a level of scrutiny that really pales in comparison to the reactions that someone like you gets for bringing in slides with barely any time for us to review them, doing 30 minutes of a speech instead of an actual department presentation, even though you were thanked at the beginning of it. I feel just kind of astounded right now. And then on top of all of that, you are proposing a $3 million increase. You're proposing an increase that goes beyond what the mayor is proposing by millions of dollars. So I want to know what other departments come here and say, never mind that whole process, but I want more money. And I just think it's important we talk about this very starkly and cut through the Minnesota nice. Chief Axtell, you are a good person. You deserve respect. You work hard. I believe that. We're also not here for friendship or niceness. We're here because our city, community, and residents expect all of us to have transparency, to fight for a funding that does not actually invest in police at the expense of basic life needs, counter to something you said earlier. And we can't just keep doing this where we just say, thank you so much, police, for doing your jobs, and here's millions more dollars. And then the libraries and the parks and the community first safety investments and everyone else who are working even more with youth and families are begging for scraps and getting the screws put to them, because where are their results? When we have so much money put into police and we are looking at the results, we have so much work to do. There's going to be many months to have this conversation, but I cannot let this moment pass without a rebuttal preamble to what you have presented. I am sorry for the intensity with which I'm bringing this. I also don't think it's unwarranted given what we just heard. I do care about having proactive conversations, but we're all in this conversation, and what has just been presented is really below the standard of what we'd expect for a budget presentation or for our community.
Thanks, Ms. Jalali. Ms. Prince?
Thank you, Council President Brenman, and thank you, Chief Axtell. And I am more than happy to drop the Minnesota nice in this conversation. I represent a ward where, as Chief Axtell noted, there are large concentrations of poverty and a much higher rate of victimization. The people who are being murdered in our city are predominantly African American. And I believe that we have not made the kind of investments in our police department that it requires. One thing I'll say is I get more calls right now about dangerous driving through our residential neighborhoods than any other call that we get. The Public Works Department is trying to look at engineering solutions. But what we all know when it comes to speeding is that traffic enforcement is critically important. And we just heard from our chief that to respond to 911 calls, they have had to dissolve the Traffic Enforcement Division. Another large issue for my neighbors on the east side are problem properties. We have dissolved the force unit, which is critically important to the people in my ward. I represent a part of town that has a higher crime rate than Ms. Jalali. And I, in my door knocking and in attending meetings with my constituents, I have not heard anyone say we should cut the number of officers. We are now down to, as I understand it, 560 officers because of, we didn't have an academy last year, and because we have attrition last year, attrition in our 2021 budget, we have $3.8 million of attrition built into our budget, which means until the department loses officers through resignations, retirements, and so forth, at the amount of 3.8 million, they can't hire the first officer to replace those missing officers. We do not, in any other city department, do we budget that level of funding for attrition. I have a question right now for John McCarthy. The mayor's budget indicates that the 22 budget increases spending for the police department by 3.5 million. And I would like to find out from Mr. McCarthy what that, I mean, not 3.5 million, 3.5%, that the mayor put a 3.5% increase in spending in the police department. So could Mr. McCarthy tell us what that is for?
Council President Brenmo and Councilmember Prince, a large chunk of that, and I can get the breakdown for you, is related to the fact that staff salary and benefits cost more next year than they do this year. That the cost to provide the exact same level of service next year is going to cost us more. And that's just due to the fact that we have COLAs, negotiated contracts, and our healthcare costs more from one year to the next. So a big chunk of that 3.5% is related to those salary and benefit costs to existing staff. On top of that, there is a reduction in that attrition amount that you just referred to get us back to the 2020 levels of about 1.7 million. There's also the general fund support for the LECPA Academy of 820,000. So all of those things combined add up to that 3.5%, and I can get the specific breakdown for you on the salary and benefit costs if you'd like.
Well, I do think it's interesting that the 3.5 million is reducing the amount of attrition that is required before we can replace officers. But I believe that number is still at 1.7 million. Is that correct, Mr. McCarthy?
Council President Brenmo and Council Member Prince, I believe it is a little bit over 2 million when you account for salary and benefits, the remaining attrition savings. And I'd say that, that's a target to meet throughout the year. And so, the finance perspective is that we need to meet that target by the end of the year. It does not, from our perspective, say that, the department can't hire until they meet that target. It's to say that between now and, between January and December, you have to meet that salary savings to live within your budget. That's our perspective on that number.
Is there any other city department that budgets attrition? I know we're doing it this year, 100,000 in the city attorney's office.
Council President Brenmo and Councilmember Prince, most other city departments include some level of attrition savings. We can get that breakdown of what each department's attrition number is for you as well.
I would definitely like to see that. I don't believe any of them come close to 3.8 million, which is what it's been this year, or 1.7. In any event, I will sum up my remarks at this point by saying I could not disagree more with Ms. Jalali about the department. We have an incredible department, and the people I represent need our police. They respect and trust our police, and I believe that we have to have a really honest, not Minnesota nice conversation about the real needs of a well-run police department in St. Paul.
Thank you, Ms. Prince. And thanks for that clarifying question on attrition. I too would like to understand how the police attrition budget maneuvering compares to other city departments. It does On the one hand, it seems like a strange way to budget and keep a budget balance. But I guess on the other hand, if there is a certain amount of attrition at the end of the year, you're left with an overage. And so just getting a clear understanding of how we manage that with our police and with other departments would be helpful for this context, because I too am interested in figuring out how do we manage that so that we're not always kind of playing that deficit game. I do want to also say that I believe I want to make I want to have a real conversation too, and I feel like sometimes when we use numbers in manipulative ways, it adds confusion to for the public. And I did, so I want to make sure that folks know that the number of sworn officers, authorized strength, has not changed to less than when the chief began. We may have less officers that are currently deployed and on staff, but the number of sworn officers has not decreased, or authorized strength has not decreased. And I think that those things get conflated. And so the capacity has remained the same. It's just that whether or not we're hired up to our sworn strength, this thing has changed over time. And part of that is this attrition question we're asking. So sound bites win the day these days. And so I just want to make sure that we're clear about that. I see Mr. Tao, Ms. Naker, Ms. Yang with hands up. So let's go to Mr. Tao.
Thank you, Council President. Chief Axel, thank you for your presentation today. Thank you for your leadership team and officer who every day they have a very difficult job. I've always said they're the social worker, psychologist, the protector. They play a lot of role. And at home, they think about their family and their kids, their spouse, and so it's a difficult job. And I think and I want to let them know I appreciate the work that they do. Listening to your presentation and listening to some of the feedback of what Councilmember Prince and Councilmember Jalali are saying. I don't want to minimize anybody's what they're saying, because I think both are true. They exist in this world where there are police brutality, there are bad cops, but there's also very good cops, and there's also this very hurtful and painful conversation that we have to have about where we're going with the city. And so I don't want to minimize any of those, but I want to speak about my own truth and my own experience as a council member in Ward 1. I want to let you all know how much I appreciate the police presence, the community engagement, and the work through the ambassador, through community leaders like Patty and Johnny Howers, and all these folks that are in the community trying to turn this community around. I feel that since 2013, that Frogtown and my ward has gotten better. We have had better police response, better engagement. I feel that we still have some issues. We still have to work on the north end. There's still lots of gun violence up there that we still need to work on. We have issue at Rice and Charles. I invite anybody from this city to come down to Rice and Charles and just walk there for half an hour, or just hang there. Somebody gonna try to sell you a dime bag or rock or whatever. I pull up one time to go to the White Castle to grab something for my son, and this guy walk up to me and try to sell me something, right? And so these things exist, and I don't want those in Ward 1. I don't even want those stuff in St. Paul. There's prostitutions, there's homelessness, there's so many things that still happen in our community that we need the good quality police officer to work with us. We have issue over at University and Arundel. We used to have a lot of issue at Wendy's, Dell, and University. And we have some issue in downtown. And it's like every time we try to solve something, wherever there's no police presence, the bad guys, they go there, right? And we have to look, there are good people trying to just make a better life for them and their family, and then there are people who are hardened criminals. They're repeat offender. They continue to victimize the community, and there are victims in this community as well. And so I appreciate your point about the story you share about the people living under poverty level, not having their vehicles stolen and things like that. And so I want to let everybody know that yes, we need to create a systematic change, structural change, and dismantle white supremacy. But at the same time, we have these real issue of people being victimized. 10 days ago, my truck got rummaged through. And, it's okay that it happened to me, but if it happened to someone else who might be less fortunate, it's going to be harder for their family. And so these things do exist. And I look forward to having a meaningful, honest conversation about how we can serve the city, how we can make sure that when we have conversation, we talk about the victim, but we also talk about the structural change that needs to happen. And at the end of the day, just remember that this is the thing that we should take personal is the city of St. Paul and how we can make the city of St. Paul better. Not department, not this personality or different things like that. Because if the police does well, the fire does well, park and rec does well, library does well, then the city of St. Paul does well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tao. Ms. Naker.
Thanks, Council President. I two comments and then two questions. First of all, just to reflect, as my colleagues have done a bit on what I'm hearing from my constituents, I'm hearing a lot of the same concerns. Problem properties and the reckless driving, as Councilmember Prince mentioned, are up everywhere, and I'm hearing about it every day. Also hearing from people who just don't feel safe walking in their neighborhoods, doing the things that they used to do for a variety of different reasons. And I'm hearing from people who do not feel safe calling 911 or having 911 be the folks who respond. So I think I'm hearing both about increases in feelings of unsafety and crime, and also this lack of trust in our department, which I know Chief, is something that we have to continually work to build. So that's some of what I'm hearing and seeing. Also, just a second comment about this process in general. I want to agree with Ms. Jalali. Chief, I really appreciate your department's commitment to data, and you provided us with a great deal of it, and I've sort of been trying to digest it and look over it while we've been talking here. But it did come to us yesterday, and I don't know what the reasons for that were, but we asked for these materials a week in advance so we have time to prepare, and I personally feel as though I'm not able to fully participate in this conversation because I haven't had time to review the reams of data that were provided to us. And when it comes that in those volumes and so with so little time, it's more like, it's data, but it's not information. So I would appreciate having more time in the future as other departments are asked to give us. So my two questions, one is a follow-up for Mr. McCarthy. I think it is very confusing, this conversation about attrition. I think it's confusing for the public. It's confusing for me. I heard you say that the police department is required to meet a certain amount of attrition, meaning a certain number of staff have to retire or leave the department in order for its budget target to be met. But that doesn't keep the department from hiring before it's met that level. And I'm really confused about what that means in practice. It seems to me either the department has to wait until that point is met before it can hire, or it doesn't have to wait. And if it doesn't have to wait, I'm confused as to what happens if by the end of the year it hasn't met its attrition target. So can you talk a little bit about, practically speaking, how this works?
Yeah, Council President Renron, Councilmember Naker, thank you for that question, and it's a great opportunity to clarify. The fact is, the truth is.
Chief, I'm sorry, but I believe that question was for Mr. McCarthy, if that's all right.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yep,
it was, but anyone is welcome to chime in, but I was addressing it to Mr. McCarthy.
Go ahead, John. Thank you.
Council President Bremo and Councilmember Naker, I think the way that finance views this is that the department has a budget that they need to manage throughout the year, and that includes assumptions around vacancies and turnovers and rehiring at lower levels for officers that leave or retire. So our goal is to manage to that budget, and as long as the department comes in under that budget or at that budget by the end of the year, then their timing on when they do the academy is up to them. The department has created a model now where they can track vacancies much more closely and have estimates on how they'll accrue those savings, and the approach that they've taken is to make sure that they can have those savings in the bank before launching an academy. I want to talk a little bit about the history of attrition here, because I think as Council President Brenmo noted, that there's some confusion around how this all came about. This came about, years ago, over a decade ago, in the time when we had big LGA cuts, and that was when we started adding attrition to everybody's department's budget. And that was just recognition of the fact that it takes time to hire folks, that when someone leaves, it's very rare that the very next day we have someone sitting in that spot at the exact same pay and benefits as the person who walked out the door. That usually there's a a turnaround time, and often the people who retire or leave the city are replaced by people who are paid less than them. And so we worked with the department at the time, the police department at the time, to create an attrition model that tracked with the way that their spending and academy practices worked back in 2009 and 10 when we first created those attrition models. I think what has become more challenging as we've seen is that that number has grown, and we also haven't seen quite as many retirements as the peak when we first created that model. Last year clearly was a very challenging budget year for everyone, and when we looked at budget cuts to departments to be able to balance our budget, the proposal that we came back with the police department was to increase attrition rather than making huge staffing cuts throughout the department. They knew that they were going to have enough turnover to reach that attrition target this year and last year, and we were able to meet that number this year. What it has done now is meant that we now are ready to do an academy that we didn't have in the budget for this year, but we know that the department can manage given that they've had the number of vacancies and attrition level that they've hit this year. So this is a long-standing practice. Again, that's not just in the police department budget, to recognize that it takes time to hire folks and that there are savings from being understaffed throughout the year. And so, the chief has put out the number that it would take to eliminate that attrition. It's $2 million to eliminate it completely, and it would take another investment, as he noted, to hire so that they never dip below 620 throughout the year. So that there's a cost to do that, and as long as everybody is aware of what that cost is, we can talk about what a plan might look like if that's what this body and the administration choose to do. This year, we made steps to move that attrition back to where it was in 2020, recognizing that we're coming out of the economic downturn from the pandemic, and that the staffing levels are at a point where we need to be able to replace vacant positions.
And I'm going to pop back to the chief for a second to fill in the gaps, but I did have a question quick on this one. And Ms. Naker, you still have the floor, but are we not able to, like if we did a one-time infusion of ARP dollars, for example, so that we were ahead of the curve, and instead of paying it down until mid-year, instead we carried forward a balance every year, that we could pay down that balance and be like at, do you understand what I'm saying? I'm saying it terribly, but instead of we'd be depleting a balance instead of working towards a deficit. Is that something we can't do just because of the way city budgeting works?
Council President Brenman, if I'm understanding right, I think it would be a challenge to be able to roll forward dollars from one year to the next within the general fund. It would be essentially, dipping into our reserves year over year, which is outside of what our standard practice is around, having kind of annually structurally balanced budgets. But it's something we could look into if I'm understanding the question correctly.
Right, like a special, like I know sometimes we have special funds that we roll over, and it just seems like we're always working out of a deficit, and like instead of starting with a surplus and working our way down. But we can talk about it. All right, so I'm going to go to Chief Axtell, and then back to Rebecca. I know that you had two questions. I think you just asked one.
Yeah, thank you very much, Council President. I apologize for the interruption earlier. The fact is, even with reinstating the attrition penalty that we served last year, even with that change, after we have an academy this fall of 65 people. Now, it's important to note, 65 people sounds wonderful, but that covers really hiring for 20 and 21. We didn't have an academy in 2020. In 2020 and 2021, we're losing 85 people. Or 80 people, 80 people. And we're hiring 65. And it takes a year to hire a police officer from the time we post the position until we have a test, we do the backgrounds, we do the medicals, we do the hiring, we do the 4 or 5 month academy. We do field training for 4 months. It takes a long time to hire officers. And with the academy we're hiring this fall, even going back to the 2019 attrition level, we are projecting that we will not be able to have an academy in 2022 under this current staffing model. So that's the problem. The staffing model that our city operates under is ineffective for maintaining the level of officers we need on the streets to make sure we can keep up with the demands for service. And I'm just respectfully requesting that we finally solve the problem.
Chief, but that's an academy, but you are able to hire laterally, right?
We need to meet the attrition dollar amount before we can hire. It's always been that way. So
All right, whether it's academy or whether it's lateral.
yeah, and we still, even if it's a lateral, you still need the background. We hire them just the same. They still need the background. They need the medicals. They need a 4 or 5 month academy, and they need field training. Because whether you're an officer from Dallas, we've hired officers from Dallas, Atlanta in the past, we still have to teach officers the St. Paul way of being a police officer. So it's all in the same.
Okay, that's a good clarification. I did not know that if you had a lateral hire that they did have to go through the St. Paul Police Academy. I'm going to bounce back to Ms. Naker. Thanks for your patience.
No, thanks, Council President, and thanks for coming back to me. I admit I am still a bit confused about my original question because the chief just said he can't hire until he's met attrition, and I heard Mr. McCarthy say he can hire even if he hasn't yet met attrition. So maybe we can come back to that clarification in a follow-up because I do think that's critical. But my second question, Chief, was I think we have this very polarized conversation a lot here about what we need in terms of public safety. I do not believe that policing alone is the answer, and I know you don't either. But I also believe we need adequate policing. And I think what I have been struggling with almost every time we have this conversation is what adequate policing means. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about your staffing model, which looks like it would be staffing at a higher level than we've had for the last 5 years, most of the year, because we usually are not up to authorized strength, right? And what outcomes the department would use to show success. In other words, what would the community be getting in exchange for those additional officers? How would we know what the adequate number of officers is for our community?
Thank you, Councilmember Naker. First of all, the increase in trust and relationships, and it's very hard to measure trust, right? But this is all about making sure that crime victims in our city are supported, making sure that when you are a victim of a crime, we have enough adequate investigative staff to follow up on those crimes. We have enough officers on the front line to be able to answer the 911 emergency calls when you're having the worst day of your life. There are many measurables that we come up with each and every year. Certainly, we want to reduce crime, and like I said earlier, ultimately, if we can reduce the need for police, that would be great. I mean, every police chief in America, if they're doing their job properly, wants to work themselves out of a job, but that unfortunately is probably not the reality we're working under. So increasing that trust, following up with victims, making sure we respond to the 911 calls in an adequate fashion, making sure that we have alternative responses with our community liaison officers, which is why I wanted to hire some more community liaison officers to take some of the burden off of sworn officers' duties. And it serves as a feeder program to our department to help us diversify the department. So there are many measurables. Ultimately, yes, we want to, but most importantly, we want to increase the level of trust so that our communities don't, in fact, view our officers as an occupying force. Additionally, this is a piece that's really critical to me, is the health and wellness and safety of our officers. I have encouraged the entire council for probably the last 3 budget presentations and meetings that we've had that to go on a ride along. If you would, those of you who haven't, please, all you need to do is call me and I could have a squad at your door Well, probably not 10 minutes like I did last year, maybe take 20 minutes this year. But we'll have a squad pick you up and go on a ride along so you're more informed. Because if you haven't ridden in a squad car, if you haven't heard the chilling words of, I need a squad to break to take a more important call, it gives that perspective that I think we all need.
Thank you, Ms. Nicker. And I believe this message was received, but just getting on the same page and clarification about this. When is the point of the department allowed to hire with the attrition? If it's simply a misunderstanding, great, we figured it out here today. If it's something else, let's get an answer on that, and we'll send the chief and Mr. McCarthy back to the drawing board to look for an answer on that particular question. I think it would be helpful. I do see Ms. Yang has a hand up, and I'm gonna call on her, but I think it would be helpful. We're doing kind of what I was afraid of doing, and that is talking about the budget without having a budget presentation. So I really would like to see some of those slides if we can, so that we're talking around the budget for 2020, which is what is the work in front of us. So I'm going to go to Ms. Yang, and then we'll look back to the chief for the slides that we discussed earlier. Ms. Yang.
Thank you. Thank you. Chief Axe, I have a few questions here. So I did take a look at the PDF files you sent over, and one of the asks that you're making is hiring on a civilian fleet manager. Is that correct?
Yes.
Did I see that? Okay.
Yes, that is the mayor's office wanted to hire a civilian fleet manager, so a sergeant who is doing that duty for us currently. We can reduce that position from our department. So yes.
Can you share like how the main roles and responsibilities of a civilian fleet manager and how many are employed right now already?
Thank you, council member. We only have one person running a fleet of hundreds of cars, and managing that is a huge job.
Can you share the roles and responsibilities of the person in this position?
Sure, I don't have the job description in front of me, but a fleet manager is responsible for purchasing vehicles, the maintenance of all our vehicles, working with the public safety garage, making sure that we have proper equipment in the vehicles, computers, radios, et cetera. The list goes on and on. It's a huge position.
So does the staff member in this position also serve as a police officer too? Like, are they an armed officer, or can you explain a bit more about that?
Yes, thank you. It is today, and it won't be next year.
So it will be a civilian position starting next year.
Correct.
What do you hope to achieve from having this position be added then?
Council member, it's not an ad. It's replacing an officer with a civilian.
Okay, can you share like what you hope to achieve from this role?
The same thing I'm receiving now, of managing the fleet. That's what I'd like to achieve.
Okay, thank you. And John McCarthy, I do have a question for you. Can you share, like, since we're about 3 months away from 2022 here, any money that isn't, I guess any money that is still remaining in the account for the vacant positions, like, is this something that can be used elsewhere for other expenses in the city, or what happens to it? I know we talked a little bit about it. I would love more clarification.
Council President Brenmo and Councilmember Yang. So unspent money on the police attrition, is that, I just want to make sure I'm understanding the question.
Yes.
So right now, I think we're projecting that the police department will come in pretty close to on budget, with the goal of, hiring starting an academy still this fall, and with those costs that they would come in, basically right on budget within their salaries. I think the question that we have is we know that there were unanticipated costs around the response to civil unrest and continued protests that were activity that we've had throughout the city, where we know we've have to spend overtime that wasn't anticipated and wasn't budgeted. So I think department wide, I think we're a little bit more cautious about whether or not there's going to be actual savings, and there may actually be the budget may actually be overspent before the end of the year. So we'll have to review, that as we get closer to the end of the year, where we're actually at, again, with the unforeseen protest activity.
Thank you. And John,
But
can you explain? Yeah, I just have another question for you. Can you explain, like dollars that were used for in response to the civil unrest, such as putting up barricades and other expenses? Like, where did that funding come out of? Like, I believe it's the police department, but where was that money? Those were obviously more allocated at the beginning of the year. So where did it come from?
Council President Bremo and Councilmember Yang, I think I'd defer to the chief on that response. I think that they used existing budget authority as far as I'm aware, but it's another one of those things that wasn't anticipated, and so we'd likely have to revisit it as we get closer to the year if they're if they're coming in close to budget. But I don't know, Chief, if you have a different response on that or additional detail.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, we have absorbed the cost for fencing within our department by making sure that we're working within our budget. So that's how it works.
Okay, thank you. And I just have two questions left. I wanted to confirm. So something that I heard the council president say earlier is that the number of sworn officers that you hope to have in the police department, it's remained the same since you've been in your position. Is that correct?
Authorized strength.
Authorized strength. Can you confirm that?
Yeah, thank you very much, council member. Looking at the chart now. So the year 2016, our authorized strength was 615. It went up in 2017 to 620. 2018 went up to 626. 2019, 635. 2020 down to 630. 2021 this year, 620, and projected 2022, 619.
Can you explain like how you come up with the numbers there? Because what I'm hearing from you is, within our police department, we hope to return to and maintain this number of authorized strength for our police officers. And I think that it's really important to understand how that number is calculated. One of the reasons why I say that is because I remember when you were in front of us doing a budget presentation last year, and I really took issue with there not being any interconnection between the community safety platform or even items that the council has invested in. And to me, like working in silo, I think is super problematic because, we're only basically getting one side of the story from the police department. And then here we are also making like really deep investments elsewhere so that, we don't continue investing in policing to address all these socioeconomic issues that are occurring in our community. And so I am really curious to understand, like, how you come up with your number, because I do want to name that I feel like what's in front of us right now isn't inclusive of the work that has been invested, through our community safety work. And also in addition to that, one of the things that we in the council have invested in as well is, just a small amount of money toward the Office of Neighborhood Safety. But that's something that I envision being, really grand and really, beneficial to our communities in terms of safety. And I feel like that isn't even being weaved into the work and that I see and the proposal I see in front of me.
Thank you, Councilmember. If Holly, if you could put up slide 30, it'll show the staffing model for our department. over the years, and it'll describe it a little bit better for us all to see.
Yeah, and as you're getting that slide up, Holly, Ms. Houston, I want to make sure, Ms. Yang, was your question answered about this fleet position? My understanding, and echoing Ms. Naker's comments, I'm absorbing this on the fly myself, but we're turning the fleet management position into a civilian role,
Mhm.
which frees up a police sergeant's time to do police work, which I would argue is not fleet. I mean, fleet management seems like you would require a different skill set. So is that the information that you received, or did you have follow-up?
No, I don't have any other follow-ups on that.
Okay.
Thank
Okay.
you.
I felt like I didn't know where we ended on that one. So thanks for allowing me a moment there to clarify. Okay. So I see Ms. Jalali has a hand up again, but I really would like to take a moment to look at the budget if you don't mind, and maybe we can, I just heard Ms. Yang say what's in front of us. And I'm like, what's in front of us? I still don't know. So I really want to take a look at this and understand what we are discussing in terms of the budget, which is what we need this information in order to set our levy limit. So if we could just take a moment for this and then go back to questions.
Sure.
Chief.
Thank you, Council President. So just back to the fleet sergeant position, it's not redeployed to other duties. It's that position's cut. So we won't have that position. You're seeing on slide 30 here, this is the historical sworn hiring model that we have. As you can see, up on the top, you'll see academy graduation, the cadence of those graduations, the dates. And then as you'll see the chart, the graph goes down, 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 down until we have an academy. And then the academy graduates, and then you'll see the peak coming up again. So we're always operating, as you can see, most of the time below the authorized strength. And as with no academy last year, and having to wait to meet our attrition penalty for this year, as you can see, that number is now down at about 563. And we have to, as I said, we have to get to that level before we have financial authorization from the city to hire an academy. In my proposal, I'm trying to come up with a solution to fix that problem. I believe we want to always maintain our authorized strength so we can provide the best service to our community. And that's slide 31 if you want to just go forward one more. This is my proposed hiring model. And as you can see, most of the time we are operating above the line, and it's going to take 3 academies to catch up to where we need to be based on the deficit we're operating under right now. Again, we've lost 81 officers by the end of this year for a 2-year period, and our academy this fall will be 65. So we're going to quickly turn into this deficit. Well, we'll already be in a deficit when we get that academy out and trained. Yeah, and they're the ones that are above the line. They're not police officers yet. They're in training.
Okay. Can you explain for us how that number is set? And because I'm looking at this and recognizing that the number, the authorized strength number that we're working with was set with the deficit model in mind. So this is a change because the number would then be kind of based on not using that deficit model. So can you just explain to us and to folks that are watching just how do we get to this authorized strength number?
Sure. Thank you, Council President. What we're trying to accomplish is the efficient, effective operation of the police department. The number has traditionally been requested by the sitting chief to present a proposal that he or she would believe is in the best interest of keeping up with the demands for services, the changing dynamics in services, such as the historic levels of protest activity we're seeing right now. We had to staff an entire new unit up to a full-time unit to handle handle those, facilitate those free speech events. So as your chief, my job is to present to the mayor, the council, the community, a model that allows me to maintain public safety and to respond to people who call 911, to build the trust that's so necessary. And this is the number that allows me to keep a number of officers on each of the shifts throughout the 24/7 operation that we run. It allows enough investigators to follow up on crimes. We'll move personnel around the department all the time when we have different crime trends throughout the year. But to continue to operate, gasping for air and trying to catch up and keeping up with the demands for service as we're losing people is something that I just have to call out.
All right. All right. And this graphic is helpful. Did you have more to add, Chief?
No, I was just going to say if Holly can put up the 2022 department budget worksheet, that's I think what you're referring to.
And Mr. McCarthy has a hand up, I think. You got below the line somehow, John.
Thanks, Council President Bremno. And I think referring back to that chart, I think one of the things that we struggle with here and just want to make sure that it's well understood is that we bring those folks on board, and even though they don't count as sworn staff on that chart until months later, we're paying them to go through the academy. And so that's where we have to manage within the budget, hit that target, have people on board who are not counted in that sworn color on the bar graph there, but are on city payroll, and that we are paying them as city staff.
So they're being paid, but they're not officially sworn officers and not
They're
able to.
a different color on the bar graph until they go through the training, right?
Thank you. Okay. All right, Chief, did you want to walk us through this?
Sure. Thank you very much. We'll just walk through here. As you can see, the preliminary target actually at the time for 2022 was $4.2 million reduction. So what I proposed as we go down the line here is the spending on the top part of the paper under budget items, FTE impact, spending reductions or revenue increases. The COPS hiring grant would be $1.25 million as an increase to our 2022 budget. Parking enforcement revenue, because I had asked for parking enforcement officers to restore the level that we used to have, and be able to, now knowing that things are opening back up, we have a lot of business areas, residents around colleges and universities that are begging for parking enforcement. We know that the revenue will come up to the levels that we were observing back in 2010 through 2014, when the fine amounts were much less than they are today. So we did the math on that, and we believe that we can bring in $2.34 million in revenue into the city. In the other column, investments or revenue decreases, to maintain 620 officers over 2022 was $624,599. The salary is $3.73 million. The academy cost $474,350. Restore parking enforcement officers, the 3 positions that were cut would be $210,000. Civilian staffing increases for our forensic services unit, which is underwater right now, is $545,000. And then to fund the LECPA students, the 25 students, was $867,000. Add community liaison officers, 6 community liaison officers to help us with alternative responses to traditional police calls and help us recruit diverse youth into the police department, 296. And then to fund an additional DNA scientist with all the extra evidence we're recovering now would be $94,000. So the revenue investments would be 6.8, and the reductions 3.59. Going down to the bottom, you'll also see replacing the failing in-car cameras, $270,000 that we would pay within special funds in our department. Transition media storage to the cloud at $20,000, and eForms RMS costs $100,000 one-time expenses. I'd also request to upgrade 3 of our positions to help with the technology needs that we have, and then to fully fund the body-worn camera project, which is $173,000, 248. So at the end of the day, at the bottom, the request to the city was $3,093,352. 93,352.
Okay. Ms. Naker, then Ms. Jalali.
Thanks, Council President. So Chief, just to clarify, this is the budget that you are proposing, that you proposed to the mayor, not the budget the mayor then proposed to us.
That's correct.
Okay. And then my one question is, you had mentioned funding this extra 3 million with ARP dollars, which are one-time dollars. But this would be an ongoing $3 million expense, I would assume, to keep that staffing model going. So how would the ongoing expense be met?
Well, I can't answer the question because I don't operate the entire city budget. I just know that we're spending a lot of money in the city on things that are going to have ongoing costs. And so I was hoping that we could commit to this as well. So with $166 million, and also knowing that it was actually on June 23rd when President Obama had said that he expects and wants cities throughout the country to use ARP funds to restore police officer positions and bring them even past up above what the pre-pandemic numbers were. So it seems like we have leadership, in Washington that is, endorsing this idea, and I'm hoping St. Paul can as well.
I'm assuming you meant President Biden. Otherwise, Obama is really getting in the business.
I'm very sorry. Yes, President Biden. My apologies.
And I would just say that the council has made it very clear, I think, in the memo that we sent to you, that we are looking at ARP as one-time expenditures. There are some proposals that look like, a bridge, a one-year bridge and the council has been asking to understand a real clear path of how that bridge has been worked into the budget, which I think is part of what's behind the question. When I look at the one-time expenses about replacing car cameras, media storage, eForms, maintenance, those to me are the one-time costs that we are definitely looking at for ARP dollars that seem like they make a lot of sense as one-time expenditures. And I think you mentioned earlier the decrease in cases against the police department. I think that you can point right to body cameras. And of course, reforms in our police department, but body cameras, I think, help everybody. And so things like replacing car cameras are, to me, like very obvious expenditures that should be considered for ARP. The ones, looking at ongoing expenditures or this as a solution for the attrition, I think in order for it to make sense, has to be a short-term bridge with a plan to fund it back. And this council, I'm not speaking for all of us, but I've heard us all say that we loathe to kick the can down the road and make the problem someone else's. So that's something that we'll really need to look deeply into. Ms. Jalali, thank you for your patience. You have the floor.
Thanks. I think it is worth pointing out that what we are being presented is actually outside of what the mayor and his staff have vetted. And so there are a lot of things in this that we should continue to question and raise attention to. I have a specific question around the fines, the proposed fines. It looks like the idea is that we would raise over $2 million in revenue from ticketing people to pay for new officers. This really seems at odds with our fair fines and fees work that has been led by the Office of Financial Empowerment. It seems like a fast track to disproportionately impacting lower income and more car dependent residents who tend to be residents of color. And I guess I'm just really trying to understand what that idea is and where you see it lining up with the equity work we're trying to do as a city. I would really appreciate some more commentary on that.
Thank you, council member. It's a great question. This enforcement activities certainly wouldn't be directed into our areas of concentrated poverty. It would be complaint-based for the most part. Areas of our city who are calling the police department, calling city council members about parking issues and business corridors, people coming in from out of the city, parking in zones that they shouldn't be, permit zones around some of our stadiums, Irvine Park, et cetera. There is a gap right now. We'd like to reinstore the parking enforcement officers, reinstate the parking enforcement officers that we've had in the past. And we believe as a result of that, in the activities that they would be producing, that money then would be generated. And again, it doesn't come to the police department. That money, all fine generation money, goes to the city general fund.
It was my understanding that the courts collect that revenue and that it doesn't go to the city fund. And that was based on a previous presentation you'd given, I think a couple of budget cycles ago, that actually it's inappropriate to collect revenues from fines and fees like this because that creates a perverse incentive. So I'm surprised to hear you say that. And could maybe a staff member clarify who actually gets the revenue, and are there any other concerns with this proposal? Maybe Director McCarthy can speak to that.
Council President Brenmoen, Council Member Jolly, the courts do collect the fines on behalf of the city, and then there's a percentage that the courts keep and that the state courts keep, and then they deliver the remaining amount to the city. And right, it no longer, at one point it was, I believe, in the police department budget, but it's not placed directly in the police department budget. It's a general revenue in the general fund. But of course, all general revenues, we don't really divide what general revenue pays for which dollar. They pay for everything in the general fund. I think the other important note here that we were concerned about, in addition to the note around our new policy around fines and fees, is just that this would represent a substantial increase. It's over 150% increase over our existing budget for fines. And at a time where, we're not seeing a lot of parking at meters right now, the finance department was concerned that we'd be able to meet this level. And when we look at the history of, the number of PEOs on staff and the number of citations issued going way back, there doesn't seem to be a direct correlation between the amount of revenue that we've collected and the number of tickets we've written, because what we've been told by the state courts is that there's less of an aggressive push by the state to collect on those fines. Probably similar to what we're doing. They're not, referring those to collections as aggressively as they used to. So it's a revenue that we've just seen decline over the last, 4 or 5 years, pretty dramatically.
Well, yeah, and I appreciate you putting that into context. I am alarmed by that increase as it relates to historical proportions. I am very concerned to hear the chief say that this is intentionally meant to target areas of concentrated poverty. That means we are literally going after a strategy where we ticket our poorest residents to make up for revenue gaps, and that doesn't square with anything I've ever heard this council or our administration talk about. So I will continue to try to understand this idea, but I'm very surprised to see it, and I think it deserves questioning. And I also want to add and connect to the work that I did do on the commission with our 45 members of the community, thinking around taking parking enforcement in general out of SPPD, because what people really want is not tickets. They want cars to be moved. They want less car drama and nuisance in general, and there are equity impacts to the ticket and hardship enforcement approach. And so I do think it's important to connect those conversations as we develop that, because if we are trying to raise money, let's talk about that. If we're trying to move cars out of the way, let's talk about that. But this seems like a really dubious recipe to get some return that would come at great cost to our residents, especially in a pandemic when our city has undertaken a lot of other measures to waive or reduce or forgive fines and fees in a range of ways that residents can get them from interacting with the city. So I think we should talk through that some more. I appreciate the information we've gotten on it.
Chief?
Thank you very much. Councilmember, thank you. Either I misspoke or you misheard. I don't know which. But this was not designed to focus in areas of concentrated poverty, not at all.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. That is significantly good to hear. Thanks.
All right. Are there more questions? Are there more slides on the budget? It's highly unusual for us to get the department's proposed budget to the mayor, not the mayor's proposed budget to us. So we're also sifting through that on our end. So if there is more budget information in this deck, I would be happy to take a look at it. We're running close to time here, but there still is time for questions. Mr. Tolbert has a hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I haven't spoken yet. I've been trying to go through the presentation a little bit here and focusing on what we are. I will start by saying over the last year, I really do appreciate the service of the women and men of the St. Paul Police Department, and both being the amount of protests and events that they had to go to, particularly at the governor's mansion. I think that number was 225 last year. That's a substantial amount. And also just being nimble and data driven. This police department, and I'm sure the chief would be the first to admit it, it's not a perfect police department, but nobody's perfect and no department is perfect. But they continue to strive to reform, improve, and be a modern police department. And I appreciate the fact that, particularly compared to other departments that I see and follow, it's a very data-driven approach to policing and the nimbleness. I know earlier this year, when we had those very scary armed carjackings, the way that the police department changed and amended how they were approached was good. And we've seen, knock on wood, a fairly substantial drop in those armed carjackings, which I know those were some of the scarier crimes that we've seen in St. Paul in recent memory, just because of their random nature and guns being involved particularly. So grateful for that. I do want to get back, because I suspect based on this conversation that there's going to be a lot of interaction going forward about are you cutting police? Are you adding police? I mean, we're going to get into, I suspect we're going to get inundated with emails depending on people's, reading of a headline on Twitter or something like that are going to be very basic in approach. But maybe just so we can get back to the budget part, I just want to clarify, and I apologize, as we said, we haven't seen this till recently, so I've been trying to read through it as we go, but also listen. And I think it's on page 12, Chief, of your presentation that was sent. I just want to get the numbers right of what's being proposed by the mayor, and then specify what that would look like with what the chief is presenting to us today. On page 12, I think looks like total 2022 budget at 104,027,529. That's the proposal from the administration. Is that right, John, or the chief?
Yes, council member, that's correct.
Okay, and then the proposal would be to increase that by it was on that, I lost it on here, but the 3.4, but some of that I believe would be grants, or is it ARP? I just want to, so we know, so when we're going through this, we can clarify, and I probably will have more questions once I have time to print this out and read it really closely without a meeting going on simultaneously. But just so I can get my numbers written down correctly.
Thank you, Councilmember. Yes, it would be in addition to that. It would be 3.1 in addition to that. And as we talk about what's the budget, what's the change, really the change, as you'll see on the mayor's, the city's proposed 2022 budget is, I think it says 3.5% increase to our budget. And that accounts again for 1.75 million in attrition, the refund that we were penalized last year, the 654,000 for LECPA, and then the $2 million speculative COLA increases for the department showed up on the budget this year. And that speculative increase did not show up in the 2021 budget. So that's a new add to our budget that shows an increase that doesn't reflect the way it was done last year.
Okay. And then the other if Mr. McCarthy has something on that specific point, but I do have just a few other questions. Yeah.
Sure, Council President Brennan and Councilmember Tolbert. So just to clarify that 3.1 or $3.2 million increase does include the assumptions around receiving the COPS grant, which would chip away at it by about 1.2 million, and also assumes that $2.3 million worth of fine revenue for additional parking fines. So net of those two, it would be a higher increase. And then just the clarification on the COLA increases, we are continuing to negotiate right now with all of the major labor unions. As I think most folks are aware, we've been working towards a 0% increase in 2021, but that isn't settled yet. And that's something that we built into the budget, an assumption around a 0% increase. We built in an assumption around an increase starting in 2022, and that's what the chief was referring to. And that's consistent with how we always budget COLA increases. Even when we don't have a final negotiated amount, we make estimates and assumptions around where those negotiations will land.
Okay. Thank you. And then on the police academy that is in process now, what date would those 65 officers be considered officers and be ready to be activated for shifts?
Thank you, Councilmember. The academy would start probably the second week in October. There'll be a 5-month academy due to the number of recruits in the academy. So October, November, December, January, February graduation, and 4 months of field training. That'll be June. June, when those officers will be available for patrol and support for crime victims in our city.
Thank you. Those are the questions I have right now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tolbert. Are there other questions? I know we're going to need to discuss this budget again. We're, as I mentioned at the front end of this meeting, we're trying to get a 30,000 foot view of the budget in advance of our levy limit obligation in the middle of September. And I think that there's a lot of questions here. There's a lot of information. I know this council is very committed to developing and the police department and the mayor's office, and is very committed to developing a new model of public safety that's upstream, that reduces crime in the first place, and then also, different dispatch approaches. But the program is really in its infancy, and I was thinking this morning about, like if I decided it was time for me to move out of my apartment to find a better apartment that fit the needs of my family, I wouldn't put in my notice until I found another apartment that fit the needs of my family. And I just feel like we're working on it, but I don't think that we're quite ready to just pull the plug here. And so I want to acknowledge, I think what I heard Ms. Yang saying is that we look at the police department just around the police department and not acknowledging the other investments we've made in public safety around the city. But also that we don't have a fully baked plan for how we're going to shift away from this model. And until that time, I want to make sure that we are properly funding our police department. I want trained police officers to show up to calls. I want rested police officers to show up to calls. I want them to be able to provide follow-up investigation and follow-up service to people who make those phone calls. And so I want to dig in on this and make sure that we're in a good place to provide the best service for our community members, because I think tired officers make mistakes and untrained officers make mistakes. And we want to make sure that they have the tools that they need in their toolbox to be the best officers they can be. And I always say, when we look out for other models of police departments that are doing it better, there's just not other models. We're doing great work here in the city and we're in front of the curve, which makes it hard because we're kind of pioneers and we're doing things differently and better. And so I think that these challenges we're facing are really because that we're pushing our boundaries and we're doing it in a thoughtful way and we're doing it in partnership. So I want to make sure that we give this particular piece of the budget appropriate amount of time so that we make the right decisions when it comes to our final budget. So this is today. We'll get a chance to dig in more to the information materials that were sent to us, and then I expect that we'll be calling the police department back for further discussion about the details. I see Ms. Jalali with a hand up, and then we should probably move towards closing.
I'm happy to move towards closing. I just think it's worth reiterating what we just received is not actually the mayor's budget proposal. It is one department head's budget proposal with a lot of ideas in it that need to get looked at as purely that, ideas. And what has also been concerning about this presentation, and part of why this is really just a very poor precedent to set, is that it undercuts our ability to do our jobs. It is really misleading to talk about the mayor's budget proposal as a decrease to SPPD. There's actually a 1.7 million increase within that. So it is really, really problematic to me that we are talking about overworked, understaffed, underfunded police officers as if there isn't an increase in the proposed budget that the mayor and his staff advanced with the input and direction of SPPD that does address that. Anything being talked about on top of that is really, really irresponsible, frankly. So I think it's important that we hold that for sake of public reporting, and we can wrap. We have been at this a long time. Thank you, everyone, and important to keep talking about this.
Chief, did you want to respond to that? And then I have Ms. Naker and Ms. Prince.
Yeah, thank you, Council President. Councilmember Jalali, thank you for your perspective, but this budget does not add any capacity for our department to have the adequate staff that we need. The increase that you're hearing about is actually reinstating what was cut last year for the attrition. So the 1.7 has no impact on the operations of our department, and the speculation that officers will get raises in the year 2022 is added into this budget. It doesn't allow us to increase any operational capacity in any form in the St. Paul Police Department. Thank you.
It is an increase though, but thank you for bringing in that nuance.
Ms. Naker and then Ms. Prince.
Thanks, Council President. I think this just conversation that just occurred reflects why it's so important to have accurate data in front of us. I'm looking at Ms. Houston's summary of the general fund department budgets and seeing a 0.7% decrease in the police budget from 21 to 22. So I really, I don't want, ideology can't get in the way of facts here. I think we all have a lot of different perspectives on this, but I want to make sure we're talking about the same data. And I frankly am confused as to what that data is right now.
Thank you, Ms. Naker. Ms. Prince. Ms. Prince, you may be on mute.
Council President Brenmon, I want to thank you for your comments about the fact that we can't move to this new model and without maintaining and adequately funding the one that we have as we move forward. Additionally, many of the recommendations of the Citizens League Committee were things that our department, our St. Paul Police Department, has pioneered and is already doing. So that was really significant to me when we saw those recommendations come out earlier this year. In terms of the addition to the budget, that was the question I asked when I first asked my question, was that the 3.5%, what is that doing to the department? And it is simply reducing the attrition number that has to be reached, as well as dealing with cost of living increases. So it was pointed out pretty clearly that it doesn't affect operations. And I want to say that I do believe it's unusual that we see a budget from a department head that is not the same one that was proposed by the mayor. That doesn't make it wrong. It doesn't make it inappropriate for this council to be aware of that and to consider it. It is, policing in St. Paul is a huge issue for the people who live here. Chief Axtell has a very high level of credibility in our community, and his willingness and frankly courage to bring this budget proposal forward is something that, whether we like it or not, it is highly unusual, and for that reason, extremely important. So I just want to say again, when we start this conversation about let's not be Minnesota nice, let's have an honest conversation. I think that's what we're having here, and I think the chief is being very transparent about the needs of the department. So, thank you.
I appreciate that, Ms. Prince, and I guess, and this is not in conflict with that, but I also think that we do a disservice to the public when we're not prepared for our meeting because we are not able to sift through the data that's in front of us. And I really think if we get to a point where, and this is to Ms. Houston, Mr. McCarthy, department heads, if we're not ready to present at the budget meeting, then let's not do it. Let's bring in a different department and get our information. I mean, we obviously have to get through all of the departments before the levy limit. But I said this earlier, and I'm going to say it again, sound bites are going to win the day here, and we're going to get a lot of misinformation published in the paper because people are quoting facts that we don't even know if they're facts. So so I agree with you, Ms. Prince. I think having a real conversation is important. I've heard that from others here as well. I just want to make sure that, one person will say one fact and the next person will say a different fact. And I just feel like it is a disservice to the public when we're not dealing with the same kind of deck of cards. I'm going to go to
Thank you, Council President Brenmon. And I agree that it would have, I'm not disagreeing that we should have had the material a week ahead and with details. So thank you.
No, I know that. And I think this is more a message to our budget team and our administration and department heads that going forward, we just have to get this stuff so that we can have a conversation that is transparent and not just gloves off, but also factual and transparent. So I want to acknowledge the chief has his hand up, and then Ms. Yang, and then we're going to have to wrap.
Thank you all very much. I appreciate the opportunity. I want to be for the record and to tell the truth. The budget information requested by the council was turned in from my office to the city on time last week. So when you got it, I'm not sure when you got it, but we submitted on time. Thank you. And everything that you received today is in supplement, in support of, in data so that it makes more sense. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Chief. So I guess then reiterating this is a message to administration, department heads, and the budget team that we need this information in order to have a good meeting. So thank you for that clarification. Ms. Yang?
Thank you. I just had a few comments to make. Wanted to express how I'm feeling in the space here today. And I am walking away with more questions. And so definitely look forward to seeing you in front of us again, Chief Axtell. There is something I want to share to you and to my council members too. I think that, what I hope to see is that, when we come and talk again, and with adjustments as well to your proposal, I really hope that what you can bring to the table is a proposal that does really truly center the voices of people in our community who are struggling the most, struggling with drug addiction, struggling to keep food on the table, struggling economically, and so much more, even beyond that, because I feel like your proposal doesn't reflect that. I also want to name that there are things that my colleagues have said at the table that, are, I feel so problematic because sometimes, seeing them being in front of a crowd of Black people, of Indigenous people, or people who are in the struggles, like I mentioned earlier, I see the response from them being different from what I see at the table here today, and really wanted to acknowledge that because I feel like in government spaces here, we can't be different depending on who is in front of us. We need to always show up as our authentic self every single time. And when it comes to this work around safety, people's lives are on the line every single day. And we need to aggressively and radically change how we are doing things in order to get people the support and help they need, rather than sticking to the ways in which it has always been. And it is so much easier for us to do things the same way. And so I do want to go back to, my question to you about, well, just wanted to bring it up again, like your vision around how many officers you would like to see. I really feel that there needs to be a change in that, because I'd like for you to consider all of the work and also the voices of the people who you serve every single day, who we all serve, who are struggling, but don't actually get the support that they need through policing itself. And it looks like, us working in a very interconnected way with all the things that we are investing in right now in our city. And there's so much in that. And I don't see it in your proposal. So I would like to see something different at the table. I wanted to share that.
Thank you, Ms. Yang. All right. Well, we've come to the very, very end of our time that we have here, and I think shared some good information. Obviously, we have outstanding questions and follow-ups that we will be in touch over. As I've mentioned on the head of the meeting, we're looking to set our levy limit as required under the law by the 15th of September, and then we'll work within that limit to set a final budget. So there's plenty of work to do in front of us. We're just getting the 30,000 foot of where our budget where our current state of our the budget that's been presented to us stands, with a plan to get in a final budget in front of the council by the end of December for final approval. So thank you, Chief, for being here today, for working through this material with us and answering our questions, for your presentation. We appreciate it. And we look forward to continuing this work with you in the months and weeks ahead of us. So thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. It's been an honor.
And colleagues, we have a full day. I was double checking here. We have library board at 2. So we are, Holly, did you have other updates you want to share with us before we sign off?
Council President Brenman, council members, no, I was just going to, at the library board meeting today, they will be presenting their general fund budget changes and ARP budget changes to the council. And then
all right,
next week we have the fire department, public works, and then at 2 p.m. HRA and PED. So
all right.
Full few weeks ahead.
Yeah. All right. So it's a full day. We'll be here in the library board's general fund budget at 2 o'clock. So since there is nothing else to come before us, we'll be adjourned.